The winter of 1942 was like a slow, suffocating death for the men imprisoned at the small, desolate German POW camp deep in the heart of occupied Europe. The cold seemed to reach into every corner of their existence, gnawing at their bones and stealing the warmth from their hearts. Each day was a battle for survival, a struggle to hold on to whatever fragments of humanity still existed within the confines of the barbed wire fence. The men, mostly British and American soldiers captured during the early years of the war, had learned to survive in the most brutal conditions imaginable. They had been through hell already, but now they found themselves in the grip of something far more sinister, the ever-present fear of what would come when night fell. The camp was nothing more than a bleak collection of dilapidated barracks surrounded by the constant vigilance of armed German guards. The smell of damp earth and stale, musty air clung to everything: the men's clothes, their skin, their food. The barbed wire that separated them from the world outside seemed more like a living, pulsing entity than a mere obstacle. It was a symbol of their imprisonment, of their isolation from everything they had once known. But it was also a reminder that no matter how much they longed for freedom, the reality was that escape was nearly impossible. Their every movement was watched, their every thought was suspect. There was no place for defiance, no room for rebellion. They were simply a collection of souls marked for suffering, waiting for the inevitable. Days in the camp had a rhythm to them. The prisoners woke to the sound of the German guards' boots on the frozen ground, the harsh bark of commands echoing through the barracks. There was no grace in the mornings, just the cold, the hunger, and the dull, oppressive weight of waiting. They were given their meager rations, which often consisted of stale bread and a thin, watery soup that barely nourished them. For the men, the mornings had become a time of resignation. They had long stopped asking how long they would remain in this place. The days blurred together into an indistinguishable haze of misery. But it was in the nights that the real terror began. There were rumors that the guards were growing increasingly ruthless, that the beatings would be more frequent, more savage. It wasn't uncommon for a prisoner to simply vanish in the dead of night, taken away by the guards for reasons no one could explain, only to be found days later, bloodied and broken. Whispers in the barracks told of punishment rounds, where the men would be dragged out one by one and beaten senseless, often for no reason other than to instill fear. For the prisoners, these rumors were not just whispers, they were reality. They had learned to brace themselves for the sound of boots that signaled the beginning of a new cycle of violence. It was inevitable. It was the price of survival in a camp that had long since lost any semblance of humanity. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, the men began to count the hours until darkness fell. They would huddle together, trying to find warmth in each other's presence, though it was hard to escape the gnawing hunger that seemed to permeate everything. They shared stories of home, tales of wives, children, distant lands, anything to keep their minds occupied and stave off the creeping dread that settled in as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. But no matter how hard they tried to distract themselves, they couldn't escape the one certainty that hung over them. Soon, the doors would be thrown open, and the guards would march in, dragging the prisoners out into the bitter cold for their punishment. It was a routine as predictable as it was terrifying. On those nights, the men had learned to hold their breath as the heavy boots approached. They could hear the sound of the guards' laughter in the distance, and it filled them with a deep, gnawing fear. Would they be the next to feel the whip of the soldier's baton against their flesh? Would they be the next to suffer for some imagined offense? There was no way to know. The fear of the unknown was far worse than the fear of the pain itself. The soldiers were unpredictable, their moods as volatile as the weather, and on some nights, the prisoners could do nothing more than hope and pray they wouldn't be the ones singled out. It was a fear that gnawed at the men constantly, leaving them exhausted and on edge. But what made it worse was the knowledge that there was no escape from it. Even if they could somehow escape the camp's physical boundaries, they would still be trapped in their minds, haunted by the terror of the nightly beatings. The darkness had become a thing to be feared, not just because it meant more pain, but because it signaled the collapse of their remaining hope. Every night, they would brace for the worst, knowing that if they were lucky, they might make it through without suffering. But it was never guaranteed. And then, one night, everything changed. The expected steps of the guards came as usual, the sound of boots echoing in the night. The prisoners stiffened, their hearts racing, their minds already preparing for the agony to come. They knew the drill. They would be dragged from their beds, forced to kneel in the snow, and beaten into submission. But something felt different this time. The guards were moving with an unusual quietness, and there was a tension in the air that the men couldn't quite place. It was as if the soldiers themselves were unsure of what they were about to do. The sound of boots grew louder, but no shouting followed. No orders were barked. The men waited, straining to hear, but the tension only deepened. And then, from the darkness, came a voice. It wasn't the harsh, guttural tone of a German officer. It wasn't the growl of a soldier preparing to strike. It was calm, almost gentle, and it came from the shadow of the barracks. The men froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the sound. It was a voice they had heard before, but never in such a context. A British guard, one of their own, stood just outside the barracks, barely visible in the dim light of the moon. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his voice was unmistakable. "Brace yourselves," he whispered, "but know this, tonight you're safe. You're going home soon." The words, barely audible, carried a weight the men could hardly comprehend. The British guard, who had been an unwilling participant in their suffering for so long, had spoken words of comfort. The irony was not lost on the men. Here, in the heart of a Nazi prison camp, the only figure who had dared to offer even a sliver of hope was the very man they had feared for so long. His words were a revelation, a promise, perhaps, or a lie. They couldn't be sure. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was something other than fear in the air: hope. The prisoners did not know what to make of this sudden shift. Could it be true? Could they actually be saved? The voice had been quiet, too quiet for them to understand its full meaning, but its effect was immediate. The men who had once been resigned to the beatings, who had accepted their suffering as a daily ritual, now found themselves in the grip of a different kind of emotion. It was fear, yes, but it was also something more. Something uncertain. Something they hadn't felt in a long time. It was the faintest hint of a possibility that they had long since abandoned. A possibility that, just maybe, they could escape this place. That, just maybe, the brutal, endless cycle of violence could be broken. For a few moments, the camp fell into an eerie silence. The guards continued their rounds, but the air was thick with confusion and disbelief. The men did not know if they should trust the words of the British guard. After all, they had been deceived before. But there was something in the tone of his voice, something in the way he had spoken, that felt different from the usual false promises. It was the first glimmer of something they hadn't seen in a long time, someone who cared. And for the men who had spent so many months in a world that had forgotten kindness, it was enough to stir the faintest, most fragile hope. They braced themselves for the worst, but something had changed. The night, which had once been their greatest enemy, now held a flicker of something they couldn't yet understand, a chance, however small, that they might not have to endure another night of terror. It was a fragile thing, hope, but it was enough to carry them through the darkness. The men, though still bound by the oppressive confines of the camp, couldn't shake the whisper that had been spoken in the dead of night. It had lingered in the cold air, a faint murmur that seemed too strange to believe, too unsettling to trust. But it was there, undeniable in its simplicity. "Brace yourselves, but know this, tonight you're safe. You're going home soon." They had all heard it, every one of them, the sudden shift in the usual cadence of suffering. It wasn't the harsh German officer's bark of command or the terrifying stomps of boots, marching to the rhythm of cruelty. It wasn't the shouts that punctuated their existence, reminding them with each syllable that they were less than men, reduced to shadows of themselves. No, this voice was different, softer, almost gentle in its reassurance. And yet, it was that very gentleness that carried a weight, a burden of disbelief that none of them were prepared to bear. The prisoners sat in stunned silence, their breath forming clouds in the freezing night air. They had been conditioned by months of brutal treatment to distrust every word, every gesture, every moment of hope that might slip through the cracks. Kindness was a weapon that could cut deeper than any knife, a reminder of what they had lost and, worse, what they would never have again. The British guards' whisper wasn't a promise they could cling to, it was a riddle wrapped in uncertainty. They had almost forgotten the very idea of home. To them, it was an abstract, unreachable fantasy, something that belonged to a time long gone, a place they would never see again. For many of the men, the idea of going home seemed as distant as the moon itself. They had been prisoners for too long, their bodies broken, their spirits withered. Days had blurred into one another, and time itself seemed to have ceased to exist. Each man had developed his own coping mechanisms. Some had become numb to the beatings, retreating into their minds, finding solace in memories of life before the war. Others had turned their anger inward, stoking the flames of defiance, clinging to the hope that one day, somehow, they would escape. But that hope had become a flickering ember, nearly extinguished by the relentless assault of pain and fear. The whispers among the prisoners in the barracks that night were hesitant. It wasn't hope they spoke of, but something more dangerous, an aching, fragile desire to believe in the possibility of freedom. They had long ago learned that nothing in the camp was ever as it seemed. The guards had fed them lies before, making empty promises of better rations, of less harsh treatment, of an end to the nightly beatings. Each time, they had been betrayed. Each time, they had been dragged back into the pit of despair. So why would this be any different? Why would the British Guard, a man who had spent months silently overseeing their suffering, suddenly become a beacon of hope? But there was something in his voice, a sincerity, perhaps, or maybe just the faintest trace of humanity, that caused a ripple in their collective psyche. Some of the men, the more hopeful or the more desperate, began to search for meaning in his words. They began to wonder if perhaps there was more to the situation than they had imagined. Could it be true? Could this one man, who had once been a silent observer, now be their savior? Or was it another cruel game, a trap designed to lure them into a false sense of security before the inevitable came crashing down upon them? The night passed in a strange kind of quiet. The guards, for reasons unknown, had not conducted their usual rounds. The sound of boots and shouted orders was absent, leaving only the sound of wind and the distant hum of the camp's grim machinery. The prisoners did not dare to move, afraid that any sign of activity would invite the wrath of the soldiers. But even in their stillness, there was a shift in the atmosphere, a tension that wasn't there before. It was as if the camp itself had held its breath, waiting for something to happen. Waiting for a sign, an answer to the question that hung in the air. What now? As dawn approached, the men remained in their places, huddled together in the barracks. The cold had sunk deep into their bones, but it was no longer the cold they feared. It was the uncertainty, the knowledge that something had changed but that they couldn't quite grasp what it was. They had all heard the whisper, but none of them dared to believe it. And yet, there was something about that whisper, a quiet reassurance, a hint of compassion, that lodged itself deep within their minds, like a seed waiting to sprout. What if this was the moment they had been waiting for? What if this man, this British guard, had been sent to guide them out of their hell? None of them dared to speak of it aloud. To do so would be to invite ridicule, to expose themselves to the crushing weight of disappointment. Instead, they went about their morning routine with a mechanical precision, moving through the motions of their prison life without acknowledging the storm of questions raging within them. But even as they ate their meager portions of bread and soup, their minds were elsewhere. The prisoner who had once been their leader, a former soldier with a sharp mind and a sharp tongue, found himself pacing restlessly. He had heard the whisper too, and though he, like the others, had learned to bury his hopes under layers of numbness, something about this moment stirred him. For the first time in months, he found himself wondering, what if? There were no answers, not yet. But the question hung in the air like a ghost, impossible to ignore. And then, as the morning began to stretch its pale fingers over the horizon, the first sound of movement broke the silence, the unmistakable clang of a door opening. A guard, his face hidden behind the shadow of his helmet, entered the barracks. The men tensed, their bodies instinctively coiling into defensive positions. Were they about to be punished? Were they about to be dragged into the snow for another round of beatings? But the guard did not shout. He did not bark orders. He didn't even raise his baton. Instead, he stood there for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over the prisoners. It was a look they had grown accustomed to over the months, cold, impassive, a reminder of their place in this hellish world. But this time, there was something different about it. There was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, something that didn't belong in the cold, detached world of the camp. The prisoners watched him, their breath held, waiting for the moment of violence to descend upon them. Instead, the guard turned and walked away. There was no command, no punishment, just silence. And with that silence came the unmistakable weight of something they had not felt in so long: hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. It didn't make sense. It didn't fit into the harsh, unforgiving world they had come to know. But it was enough to stir them from their stupor, enough to make them wonder, what if? For the rest of the day, the prisoners moved through the camp as if in a dream. There was no longer a rhythm to their existence, no longer the endless cycle of fear and punishment. It was as if the world had momentarily shifted, like the shadows of the camp had been momentarily lifted, just enough for them to see a glimmer of possibility. The British Guards' whisper had done something to them. It had broken through the armor of cynicism and despair that had encased them, and now, they found themselves wondering if it was possible to hope again. They had learned to survive without hope, to endure the worst of humanity's cruelty with nothing more than the barest will to live. But now, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about their existence. That night, the sound of boots did not come. The guards did not conduct their usual rounds, and the prisoners, still wrapped in the strange shroud of uncertainty, waited in silence. What would tomorrow bring? Would the guards' words prove to be a cruel joke, a final trick played on them by the enemy? Or was it the beginning of something else? Something they could not yet understand? For the first time in a long time, the prisoners allowed themselves to think the impossible thought. What if they could escape? The hours between the whispered promise and the dawning light stretched endlessly, as though time itself had become a vague, untrustworthy concept. The men, though still living in the same brutal conditions, couldn't shake the disorienting sense of possibility that had taken root within them. The cold, the hunger, the ceaseless despair, they had been their constant companions for so long that they had come to accept them as inevitable parts of their existence. And yet, now, after that brief moment of soft reassurance from the British Guard, something had shifted. The oppressive weight of fear and hopelessness that had governed their lives for months was no longer all-encompassing. There was now a flicker of doubt in the minds of the men, a doubt about their reality, their fate, and perhaps even about what they had come to accept as the unforgiving nature of their captivity. The first light of dawn filtered weakly through the grimy windows of the barracks, casting long shadows across the cold, bare wooden floors. The men lay in silence, their minds still buzzing with the words they had heard the night before. "You're safe. You're going home soon." They had repeated the words to themselves in their heads, over and over again, as if trying to convince themselves that they weren't simply imagining it. But the doubt still gnawed at them. It was not just the disbelief that someone within the camp could offer them hope, but the fear of false hope. They had been deceived before, and the notion of trusting anyone, especially someone who had once been an instrument of their suffering, was terrifying. Was this another cruel trick, designed to lull them into complacency before the next round of violence? Or was it truly a chance, however small, for them to escape the hell they had been trapped in for so long? The morning passed with an unnerving stillness. The guards went about their rounds as usual, their heavy boots sounding against the frozen earth. The men went through their routines, but the motions seemed mechanical, as though they were going through the motions of a life that no longer felt real. Their minds kept returning to that moment of fragility, when they had been offered something as simple, yet as profound as reassurance. They wondered what it meant. Could they truly escape the brutality of the camp, or was this the calm before the storm? Every sound, every glance, every shadow seemed laden with significance, as though the very air itself was thick with the anticipation of something yet to come. But nothing happened. The day stretched on in its usual monotony, each minute feeling like a lifetime. By the time the evening came, the men were on edge, their nerves stretched taut by the uncertainty of the day. They had no way of knowing what the night would bring. Would the usual routine resume, with the guards dragging them from their beds and forcing them to endure the violent rituals that had become the only certainty in their lives? Or would something different happen? Would the British guards' words finally bear fruit, and they would be delivered from their suffering? There was no way to know. The air was thick with tension, and the camp felt more oppressive than ever. Even the prisoners who had been the most resigned to their fate could not deny the strange unease that gripped them. As night fell and the camp settled into its usual eerie quiet, the men gathered together in their barracks, speaking in hushed tones, careful not to draw the attention of the guards. They shared their thoughts, each man grappling with the same question: what now? Some were still skeptical, unwilling to trust the words of the British Guard. They had learned long ago to expect nothing but pain, and they feared that hope would only bring more suffering. But there were others who had begun to entertain the impossible thought. What if there was a chance? What if this was the opportunity they had been waiting for, the spark that could light the way to freedom? And then, just as the men were beginning to settle into an uneasy silence, the unthinkable happened. The sound of boots approaching their barracks once again filled the air, but this time it was different. The usual shouts, the rough commands, the harsh commands of their captors, were absent. The footsteps were measured, purposeful, but not aggressive. The men braced themselves, their bodies tensing in anticipation of whatever punishment was coming their way. The cold in their bones was nothing compared to the cold that had settled in their hearts. They had been through this too many times to believe in anything but more violence. They had learned to expect the worst, and they had come to terms with it. The beatings, the isolation, the endless brutality, it had become a part of them. But when the door to the barracks opened, it wasn't a German officer or one of the crueler soldiers who stepped inside. It was the British Guard. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette outlined by the dim light of the lantern outside. His presence was a shock, a break in the expected pattern, and it threw the men into a momentary state of confusion. Was this some kind of trick? Were they being moved from the barracks to be punished elsewhere? They could not make sense of it. But the guard, his face still obscured by shadows, did not move or speak immediately. He simply stood there looking at them. The seconds felt like hours. And then, finally, he spoke. "I'm here to help you escape." The words were soft, almost too quiet to believe. The men couldn't process them at first. Their minds, still clouded by disbelief, could hardly grasp the enormity of what had just been said. Escape? It seemed impossible, ridiculous even. They were prisoners in a Nazi camp, surrounded by armed guards, locked behind layers of barbed wire and watchtowers. How could anyone possibly escape from here? And yet, the British Guard's presence in the doorway, his solemn expression, suggested that he was not joking. He was not here to mock them. The words hung in the air, charged with a gravity that the men could not deny. But the disbelief lingered. Could they trust him? Could they trust anyone in this place, especially someone who had been complicit in their suffering for so long? The guard had been a figure of fear, a silent observer of their pain. He had never shown them kindness or even acknowledgement. He had been just another part of the oppressive machinery that had been grinding them down, day by day. How could they reconcile that with the man who stood before them now, offering them a chance at freedom? It was too much to comprehend in that moment. Their minds scrambled for answers, for explanations, for anything that could make sense of the madness that had been thrust upon them. The silence stretched on, until one of the men, a weary, gaunt figure who had seen far too many horrors to believe in miracles, finally spoke. His voice was rough, cracked from the long months of deprivation, but there was a fire in it that hadn't been there before. "How do we know we can trust you?" he asked, his words heavy with the weight of experience. He wasn't the only one who felt this way. Doubt and suspicion ran deep in the veins of every prisoner. No one had survived this long by trusting anyone, least of all their captors or those who had been forced into collaboration. The guard's eyes flickered in the dim light, but he didn't flinch. He didn't back down. Instead, he stepped forward, closer to the men, and in a voice that was nearly drowned out by the silence of the room, he gave them the only answer he could. "I'm British. I've been here for months, working for the Germans. But I'm not who you think I am. I've been trying to sabotage the camp from within. I've helped others before. I can help you." The words were heavy, laden with meaning, but they only served to deepen the confusion in the prisoners' minds. Could it really be true? Could this man, who had once been an instrument of their suffering, now be offering them salvation? Was he telling the truth, or was this a trick to lead them into a trap, to ensnare them in the tightening web of the Nazis' control? There were no easy answers, no guarantees. But one thing was clear: the possibility had been offered. For a few moments, no one moved, no one spoke. The air in the barracks was thick with the weight of the decision before them. The uncertainty, the doubt, the fear, these were all things they had lived with for so long that they had become part of the fabric of their existence. And now, in the quiet of the room, the men found themselves at the precipice of something they had never dared to believe in: freedom. As they exchanged looks, a silent understanding passed between them. They had no choice but to follow this unexpected lead. To hesitate was to condemn themselves to another round of suffering, another cycle of violence. Perhaps this was their chance, however fleeting, to escape the nightmare that had defined their existence for so long. Without a word, they nodded to one another. The decision was made. The escape plan, as crazy and impossible as it seemed, would be set in motion. They would trust the British Guard, even if it meant risking everything they had left. The Guard's whisper, that moment of tenderness in the midst of horror, had opened the door to a new possibility. And as they quietly gathered their meager belongings, preparing for the impossible task ahead, they realized that they were no longer merely surviving. They were, for the first time in months, fighting to live. In the hours after the British Guard's startling offer, the atmosphere in the barracks was thick with a strange tension. The men were still processing the enormity of what had just been said, and yet, they knew they had no choice but to act. They were not simply prisoners anymore. They were participants in something far greater, something that could alter the course of their existence. In that moment, the reality of their situation became clearer than ever before. They were facing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but it was one that came at an enormous risk. The stakes had never been higher. To take action meant defying everything they had known for so long, and in doing so, they could very well bring down the wrath of their captors upon themselves. But to remain in the camp, to continue existing in the endless cycle of suffering, meant surrendering to the very forces that had stripped them of their humanity. And so, as the men processed the Guard's words, their thoughts turned to the plan. Could they trust him? Could they trust anyone, especially someone who had spent months serving the very people who had tormented them? There was no way to know for sure, but the flicker of hope he had ignited was undeniable. Hope was a fragile thing easily crushed, but for the first time in months, it was the one thing that gave them reason to act. The very thought of escape, of freedom, no matter how distant or impossible it seemed, filled the air with a sense of purpose. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they began to believe that they could shape their own destiny. The question now was, how? The British Guard had provided no concrete details, only vague assurances that he would help them. He had spoken of his work inside the camp, of subtle acts of sabotage that had been carried out over time to undermine the Germans' operations. He had spoken of his position among the guards, of his ability to move about undetected, and of how he had quietly been facilitating small acts of resistance from the inside. It was clear that he had been operating under the radar, working in the shadows, and had managed to avoid detection by the German officers. But now, with the moment of truth at hand, the risks were far greater. If the Germans discovered the plot, it would mean certain death, not just for the British Guard, but for the men he was trying to save as well. There could be no mistakes, no room for failure. The prisoners gathered in small groups, whispering quietly amongst themselves. There was little time to waste. The hours seemed to stretch endlessly as they worked through the details of their escape, all the while knowing that the window of opportunity was narrow and closing fast. They had to move quickly, decisively, or the chance would slip away. The plan, such as it was vague at best. The British Guard had spoken of using the cover of darkness, of slipping past the watchful eyes of the German sentries. He had hinted at certain routes through the camp that would lead them to the perimeter fence, and from there, they would have to make their way into the surrounding woods, where they could find shelter. But even that was no guarantee. The woods were crawling with German patrols, and the men had no weapons, no means of defending themselves. They would have to rely entirely on stealth, on their ability to move unnoticed. They would have to become shadows themselves, blending into the night like ghosts, unseen and unheard. The prisoners knew this would be no easy task. The camp was heavily guarded, with watchtowers positioned at strategic points, their searchlights sweeping across the ground every few minutes. The Germans had eyes everywhere. Every prisoner was assigned to a work detail, and every movement was closely monitored. The guards were merciless in their supervision, and any deviation from the routine was met with swift punishment. The escape would require a level of precision and coordination that none of them had ever attempted before. But it was their only option. As the night drew closer, the tension among the prisoners mounted. The hours dragged on, each minute slipping by like sand through an hourglass. They could feel the weight of time pressing down on them, each second pushing them closer to the brink. The darkness was coming, and with it, the moment of reckoning. They had made the decision to act, but now they had to summon the courage to follow through. They could no longer afford to hesitate, to second-guess themselves. The time for doubt was over. The time for action had arrived. The guard's plan, though vague, was their only hope. He had promised to lead them through the camp's labyrinthine network of corridors, past the guards, and out into the open. But it was not just the physical obstacles they would have to overcome, it was the mental ones. The constant fear, the years of conditioning, the deep-set belief that they were doomed to remain prisoners forever. The men had lived in a state of perpetual terror for so long that the very idea of escaping seemed like a dream, a distant, unattainable fantasy. But now that dream was within reach. It was a fragile, elusive thing, but it was there. They could see it, taste it, feel it in their bones. And it made all the difference. They had to trust the British Guard, despite their fears, despite the gnawing doubts that clawed at their insides. They had no choice. The alternative was to continue living in the nightmare that had been their existence for so long. They would have to take a leap of faith, to believe that this man, who had once been their captor, was now their ally. The risks were immense, but the rewards, freedom, escape, the chance to live again, were worth any price. The night arrived, and the camp fell into its usual routine. The men, steeling themselves for what was to come, kept their movements as quiet as possible. They didn't speak much, knowing that any sound, any misstep, could alert the guards. The air was thick with the sound of breathing, the quiet rustling of clothes as they gathered their belongings. Some of the men had already begun to prepare, hiding small items in the folds of their clothing, things that could be used for the journey ahead. But mostly, they focused on staying as calm as possible, trying to keep their nerves in check. They couldn't afford to let fear take over. Not now. As the hour grew late, the British Guard appeared once again. His face was hard to make out in the low light, but his presence was unmistakable. He gave them a brief nod, signaling that it was time. They moved as one, a single unit, as they followed him through the darkened corridors of the camp. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. They had no room for error. They passed the watchtowers, their searchlights sweeping across the ground, but they stayed low, keeping to the shadows, moving only when it was safe. The sound of boots on the frozen earth was a constant companion, a reminder of the danger they were in. But they kept moving, their hearts pounding in their chests, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. The tension was unbearable as they neared the perimeter fence. They could hear the distant murmur of the German patrols, their voices drifting on the wind, but they remained still, waiting for the right moment. Every second felt like an eternity. And then, at last, they reached the fence, the final barrier between them and freedom. The guard had explained how to disable the alarm system, how to cut through the wire without making a sound. It was a delicate operation, but they had no choice. They worked quickly, their hands shaking from the cold and the anticipation. One by one, they slipped through the hole in the fence, into the dark woods beyond. For a moment, it felt as if they had entered another world. The camp, with its walls and its watchtowers, its guards and its misery, was behind them. They were free, or at least free for the moment. But the danger was far from over. The woods were no sanctuary, they were just another obstacle in their path. The men knew they had to move quickly, to cover as much ground as possible before the German patrols realized they were gone.